The rust on the gate shrieked like a dying man when Jake pushed it open. It was a sound he knew too well. He walked the perimeter of the derelict farm, his limp a steady percussive beat against the hard-packed dirt. Each step was a memory, each gust of November wind a whisper from a ghost. This land wasn't his inheritance. It was his purgatory, a graveyard of his father's failures that now mirrored his own. He ran a hand over his face, the scar tissue pulling tight around his eye, a permanent reminder of the sun and the sand and the blast that had ripped his world apart. The farmhouse stood skeletal against a bruised twilight sky, its windows like vacant eyes. Inside this there was a cot, a bottle of cheap whiskey, and the specter of his team. 6 men, 6 brothers. He was the only one who had come home, or at least his body had. His soul was still scattered across a dusty road in Kandahar province. The doctors called it post-traumatic stress disorder. They gave him pills that turned the world to gray mush and pamphlets with smiling hollow-eyed veterans who had supposedly found peace. Jake called it Tuesday. He worked the land not to grow anything, but to exhaust the body so the mind would shut down. He fixed fences that held nothing in, cleared fields that would never be planted. It was penance, a physical manifestation of the war that still raged behind his eyes. That evening the memory came unbidden, as it always did. The weight of his gear, the smell of diesel and baked earth. The pressure wave hit first, a silent crushing hand that stole the air from his lungs. Then the sound, a universe-ending roar that tore through his ears and plunged him into a world of ringing silence. He remembered the flash, a brilliant, hateful white. He remembered the rain of metal and earth. He remembered Mark's hand, reaching for him an instant before being consumed by the light. Jake stumbled, catching himself on a rotten fence post. The wood splintered under his grip. He squeezed until the splinters bit into his palm. The sharp, immediate pain a welcome anchor to the here and now. He was not in the desert. He was in Pennsylvania. The ringing in his ears was just tinnitus. The ghost of the explosion that had never left him. The screaming was only in his head. He straightened up, the cold air slapped to his senses. His breath plumed in the fading light. He was alone. That was the point. No one to hurt, no one to lose. Just him and the ghost, living out their sentence together in the quiet decay of his past. He turned back toward the house, the whiskey bottle calling his name, promising a few hours of numb oblivion before the nightmares came to claim him. The world was broken and so was he. There was nothing left to fix. He thought he was the only living thing for miles, besides the crows that watched him from the dead branches of the old oak. But then he heard it. It was faint, carried on the wind, almost lost beneath the constant high-pitched whine in his ears. A whimper. It was thin and ragged, a sound of pure misery. He stopped, head cocked, listening. A trick of the wind, maybe. A branch rubbing against the old barn. He dismissed it and took another step toward the house. There it was again, clearer this time. A low, mournful cry that scraped at something deep inside him. A part of himself he thought had died in the sand. It was the sound of a creature in its final extremity of suffering. He changed course, his boots crunching over dead leaves as he moved toward the source. The collapsed section of the north barn. The structure had caved in years ago, a tangle of rotted timbers and rusted tin roofing that his father had never had the money or the will to clear. It was a dangerous mess, a tetanus trap waiting for the unwary. Jake moved with the fluid silence that had kept him alive in places where noise meant death. He picked his way through the debris, his eyes scanning, assessing. The whimpering grew louder, punctuated by a weak, rattling cough. It came from beneath a massive fallen beam, in a dark pocket of shadow and ruin. He peered into the darkness. At first all he saw were 2 eyes, glowing with a faint feral light. They weren't angry. They were terrified. As his own eyes adjusted, the shape resolved itself. A dog. A German shepherd, or what was left of one. Its coat was matted with mud and blood. Its frame was skeletal, each rib a stark ridge beneath its skin. One of its hind legs was twisted at an unnatural angle, pinned beneath a smaller piece of debris. The dog let out another whimper, a soft, defeated sound. It didn't try to bark or growl. It had no fight left. It was simply waiting to die. Jake stared into those dark, liquid eyes, and the world fell away. He saw the same exhaustion, the same deep, soul-crushing pain that greeted him in the mirror every morning. He saw a fellow survivor, a veteran of a different, but no less brutal war. The whiskey, the cot, the ghosts, they all faded into the background. In that moment, there was only this broken creature and the sudden, fierce, and utterly illogical conviction that he could not let it die. Not like this. Not alone in the dark. Something shifted in his chest, a tectonic plate of grief and numbness grinding into motion for the first time in years. It was a feeling he barely recognized. A purpose. Easy now, he heard himself say, his voice a low, gravelly rasp from disuse. He crouched, moving slowly, keeping his hands visible. The dog watched him, its breathing shallow. It flinched when he got closer, a tremor running through its emaciated body. I'm not going to hurt you. The words felt foreign on his tongue. He had not offered reassurance to anything or anyone in a very long time. A shadow detached itself from the deeper darkness of the woods behind the barn. A man emerged, his shape bulky and mean. He carried a length of heavy chain in one hand. You get away from my dog. Spook. Jake didn't look away from the shepherd. He registered the man peripherally. Greasy hair, stained jacket, the sour smell of cheap beer and cruelty. This was the Tier 1 antagonist, the bully. He knew the type. They existed everywhere, in every country. Men who found their strength in the weakness of others. This your dog? Jake asked, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. Damn right he is. Worthless cur. Was gonna put him down myself before he got himself trapped. The man, Cletus, spat, taking a step forward. He swung the chain lightly, a petty show of intimidation. Now step aside. The shepherd whined again, pressing itself deeper into the dirt, trying to make itself smaller. Jake saw the old wounds on its body, the pattern of scars that were not from any accident. They were deliberate, inflicted. A hot, clean rage, an emotion he hadn't felt since the ambush, burned through the fog in his mind. It was clarifying. It was righteous. He rose slowly to his full height. He wasn't a large man, but years of special operations had honed him into something dense and dangerous, a weapon carved from bone and gristle. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He simply met the man's gaze. No, Jake said. Cletus blinked, thrown off by the absolute lack of fear. What did you say to me? I said no. You're not touching this dog. Jake took one step forward, closing the distance. His movements were economical, predatory. The farmer was gone. The seal was back. He saw Cletus not as a man, but as a target, a threat to be assessed and neutralized. He noted the man's stance, his balance, the way he held the chain. He saw 3 ways to break his arm, 4 ways to drop him to the ground unconscious. The knowledge was as natural to him as breathing. Cletus saw the shift. He saw the emptiness in Jake's eyes replaced by something ancient and lethal. He saw a man who had walked through hell and was not impressed by a bully with a chain. The bravado faltered. He's my property. Not anymore, Jake said. His voice was quiet, but it carried the weight of thunderheads. Walk away. Now, or I will remove you from my property. And you won't walk away. There was no threat of a fight. There was only a promise of a conclusion. Cletus hesitated, his little kingdom of cruelty crumbling before a sovereign of violence he could not comprehend. He looked from Jake's dead eyes to the dog, then back again. He licked his lips, the chain suddenly feeling heavy and useless in his hand. He took a shuffling step back, then another. Freak, he muttered, then turned and lumbered back into the woods, swallowed by the darkness he came from. Jake didn't watch him go. The threat was gone. He turned his full attention back to the dog. He was alone with the animal now, the silence of the farm settling around them once more. The rescue had just begun. He knelt again, his knees sinking into the cold, damp earth. Okay, buddy, he whispered. Let's get you out of there. He assessed the trap. The main beam was too heavy to move, but the smaller piece of timber pinning the dog's leg was manageable. The problem was leverage and the fact that any movement could cause a further collapse. And the dog itself. It was terrified, likely to bite out of pain and fear. Jake lay on his stomach, wriggling into the tight space next to the animal. The smell of infection and damp fur filled his nostrils. It's all right, he murmured, his voice a low, steady rumble. He didn't try to touch the dog yet. He just let it get used to his presence, his scent. He lay there for long minutes, speaking nonsense in a calming tone, the same way he used to talk to new guys on the team before their first jump. Finally, he extended a hand, palm up, and placed it on the ground a few inches from the dog's nose. The shepherd watched it, a low growl vibrating in its chest. It was a warning, but a weak one. It was too exhausted to be a real threat. I know, Jake said softly. I know it hurts. He slowly, deliberately began to work. He used a piece of rebar he'd found as a lever. wedging it under the timber. The work was slow, agonizing. Every shift of the wood sent tremors through the ground and drew a pained yelp from the dog. Jake gritted his teeth, his muscles straining. Sweat beaded on his forehead, mingling with the grime. He focused on the task, blocking out the pain in his own leg, the ringing in his ears, the ghosts at his back. With a final groaning heave, the timber lifted just enough. Jake kicked it aside with his good leg. The shepherd was free. It tried to scramble away, but its injured leg collapsed and it fell with a cry. Jake moved quickly, gently scooping the animal into his arms. It weighed almost nothing, a bag of bones held together by matted fur and a stubborn heartbeat. The dog went rigid then, as if sensing the intent behind the touch. It went limp, its head resting against Jake's chest. It was an act of complete and total surrender. He carried the dog back to the farmhouse, his limp more pronounced under the added weight. He kicked the door open and carried his charge into the Spartan kitchen. He laid the shepherd on a pile of old blankets he pulled from a closet, the only soft thing in the entire house. The dog watched him with those dark, knowing eyes as Jake cleaned its wounds. He was surprisingly gentle. His calloused hands, hands designed to handle weapons of war, now working with a surgeon's care. He cleaned the filth from its coat, applied antiseptic to the open sores, and splinted the broken leg as best he could with strips of wood from a broken chair and torn pieces of a t-shirt. As he worked, he noticed it. On the inside of the dog's ear, nearly obscured by dirt and a long scar, was a tattoo. It wasn't the crude mark of a breeder. It was precise, military. A series of letters and numbers. Kilo 27. Jake's blood ran cold. He knew that designation. He had seen it before. He gently felt around the dog's neck and shoulders. His fingers found it. A small hard lump under the skin. A microchip. This was no stray. This was a soldier. He finished his work and set down a bowl of water, which the dog drank from greedily. It ignored the food he offered. The pain and exhaustion were too great. It curled up on the blankets, shivering, and finally closed its eyes. Jake sat on the floor, his back against the cold kitchen cabinets, and watched the dog sleep. The silence of the house was different now. It was no longer empty. He looked at the designation he had scrawled on a piece of paper. Kilo 27. A military working dog. An MWD. Abused, broken, and left for dead on his land. The rage from before returned, but it was colder now, sharper. This wasn't just about animal cruelty. This was about a soldier left behind. It was a violation of the code he had lived and nearly died for. Someone had betrayed this dog. Someone was going to answer for it. He felt the old instinct stirring, the hunter's mindset reasserting itself. He had a new mission. The next morning, the dog was weak but alive. Jake knew he needed professional help. His makeshift splint and antiseptic were not enough. He found the number for the nearest veterinary clinic in a yellowed phone book. A woman with a tired but steady voice answered. Dr. Eris Thorne. I have an injured German shepherd, he said. His voice clipped. Severe malnourishment, multiple lacerations, and a compound fracture of the left rear tibia. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Okay, bring him in. Can you get here in 30 minutes? On my way. Lifting the dog was easier this time. It didn't struggle. It seemed to understand that he was trying to help. He placed it carefully on the passenger seat of his beat-up truck, wrapped in the same blankets. During the drive, the dog rested its head on the center console, its eyes never leaving Jake's face. It was the first time anything had looked at him with something other than pity or fear in years. It looked at him with trust. Dr. Thorne's clinic was small and clean, a stark contrast to the decay of the farm. The air smelled of bleach and something vaguely animal. She was a woman in her late 30s with sharp, intelligent eyes that missed nothing. She took in Jake's scarred face, his military-style jacket, and the grim set of his jaw. Then she looked at the dog in his arms, and her professional demeanor softened with a flicker of compassion and anger. My God, she said softly. Get him on the table. Now. For the next hour, Jake stood silently in the corner of the examination room as she worked. He watched her efficient, compassionate hands as she sedated the dog, took x-rays, and began the process of cleaning and setting the broken leg. She was a professional, and he respected that. He's been starved for weeks, she said, not looking up from her work. The breaks in these ribs are old. The leg is a fresh injury. Whoever did this... She trailed off, her jaw tight. They're a monster. I know, Jake said. He has a microchip, she continued, holding up a scanner. Standard procedure is to check it. Do you know who he belongs to? I have an idea, Jake said. Scan it. She ran the scanner over the dog's shoulder. It beeped. She looked at the screen, and her eyebrows shot up. She tried again. The result was the same. That's odd. The chip is active, but the registration data is encrypted. Department of Defense level. I've never seen that before on a domestic animal. Jake's suspicion solidified into cold certainty. He has a tattoo in his right ear. Kilo 27. Eris Thorne looked from the scanner to Jake, her expression shifting from curiosity to alarm. She was putting the pieces together. The scarred, intense man. The military-grade dog with encrypted data. Who are you? She asked, her voice cautious. It doesn't matter who I am, Jake replied. What matters is who he is. He's a veteran, and someone left him behind. Her scanner, by querying the encrypted chip, had likely tripped a silent alarm on some government server. They had just lit a beacon. He knew, with the instinct of a hunted man, that they were no longer alone. Trouble was coming. The people who lost a dog like this weren't the type to just let it go. And they wouldn't be friendly. What are you going to do? Eris asked, her eyes fixed on the sleeping dog, now resting more comfortably under a thermal blanket, an IV dripping fluid into its leg. I'm going to take him home. Protect him, Jake said. It was the simplest, most honest statement he had made in 3 years. He needs to stay here, she protested. He needs monitoring, medication. He'll be safer with me. Jake cut her off, his tone leaving no room for argument. Give me whatever supplies you can spare. I'll pay for them, and for your time. He pulled a wad of crumpled bills from his pocket, nearly all the money he had left in the world, and put it on the counter. She looked at the money, then at Jake's determined face, and finally at the dog. She saw the connection between them, the unspoken bond of two wounded warriors. She made a decision. Keep your money, she said, her voice firm. I'll give you what you need. Antibiotics, painkillers. But you have to call me. Every 12 hours. No exceptions. If his condition worsens, you bring him back. Deal? Deal, Jake said. He carried the sedated dog back to his truck along with a box of medical supplies. As he drove back down the long gravel road to the farm, he checked his rearview mirror constantly. The road was empty, but he felt it, a prickling on his skin, the feeling of being watched. The war was not over. It had just followed him home. He spent the rest of the day fortifying the farmhouse. It wasn't paranoia. It was training. He checked sight lines, reinforced doors, and placed broken glass under the windowsills. He cleaned and oiled the hunting rifle he kept in his father's old gun locker, his movements sure in practice. He found 2 boxes of ammunition. It wasn't much, but it would have to be enough. The dog, who he now thought of only as Kilo, slept peacefully on the blankets, oblivious to the storm that was gathering. Jake sat with him, one hand resting lightly on the dog's ribcage, feeling the steady rise and fall of his breath. This was real, this contact, this life in his hands. It was more real than the ghosts, more real than the whiskey. Night fell like a shroud. The wind howled around the corners of the old house. Jake didn't turn on the lights. He sat in the darkness, the rifle across his lap, his senses on high alert. He was back on watch. For the first time in a long time, he was not just waiting for the end. He was standing against it. The attack came just after midnight. There was no warning, no sound of an engine. They were professionals. A single suppressed gunshot shattered the kitchen window. The bullet hissed past Jake's head and slammed into the wall behind him. Instinct took over. Jake was on the floor before the glass finished falling, dragging Kilo's blankets and the dog with him. He shoved the dog under the heavy oak table. Stay, he commanded, his voice a low, urgent whisper. Another shot punched through the thin wall. Then another. They were using the muzzle flashes to zero in on him. Amateurs. Or overconfident. He crawled on his belly, the rifle held tight against his chest, splinters and glass digging into his skin. He moved toward the back of the house, away from the main point of entry. They would expect him to be pinned down in the main room. He would use that. He heard them at the front door, the sound of a pry bar splintering the old wood. 2 of them at least, maybe 3. They moved with quiet efficiency. Mercenaries, not cartel thugs. They were here for the asset. Jake reached the dark hallway that led to the back bedroom. He pressed himself flat against the wall, controlling his breathing, slowing his heart rate. The world narrowed to a tunnel. There was only the mission. Protect the asset. Survive. The front door burst open. 2 figures clad in black tactical gear and carrying suppressed rifles swept into the room. They moved in a practiced fluid formation, their weapon-mounted lights cutting cones of white through the darkness. Clear, one of them murmured into his throat. Mike, target is not in the main room. Find the asset, a second voice replied. They began to clear the house room by room. Jake waited. Patience was a weapon. The first man approached the hallway, his rifle up, his light beam dancing over the peeling wallpaper. Jake held his breath. The man stepped past the threshold. Now. He exploded from the darkness like a coiled spring. He didn't use his rifle. Too loud, even with the distance. He slammed the butt of the weapon into the side of the man's head, just behind the ear. A sickening crunch. The man dropped like a stone, his helmet doing nothing to stop the concussive force. One down. Contact, the second man yelled, spinning around. He raised his rifle, but he was too slow. Jake was already moving, using the first man's falling body as a shield. He brought his own rifle up and fired. One shot. Center mass. The crack of the unsuppressed hunting rifle was deafening in the enclosed space. The mercenary grunted and staggered back, his body armor absorbing the impact but not the kinetic energy. Before the man could recover, Jake charged, closing the distance in 2 long strides. He drove his shoulder into the man's chest, ramming him backward into the wall. The mercenary's head snapped back, hitting the plaster with a dull thud. Jake disarmed him with a brutal twist of the wrist, sending the rifle clattering to the floor. He delivered a series of rapid, precise strikes to the man's throat and collarbone. The fight was over in seconds. Silence descended again, thick and heavy, broken only by the ringing in Jake's ears and his own ragged breathing. He stood over the 2 unconscious forms, his chest heaving. The rust was gone. The machine was working again. Then he heard a noise from outside. A third man. The Overwatch. Suddenly, from under the kitchen table, a low guttural growl echoed through the house. Kilo was awake. Despite his injuries, he was on his feet, his body tensed, his eyes blazing with a protective fury. He let out a single deep-throated bark that was pure menace. The man outside shouted, "They've got the package, it's active, flank and flush." Jake grabbed the fallen mercenary's suppressed rifle. Superior firepower. He checked the magazine. Nearly full. He crept to the broken window, peering out into the moonless night. He saw movement by the old barn, a shadow detaching itself from other shadows. Jake raised the rifle, finding the target in the weapon's optic. He exhaled, his finger tightening on the trigger. A blur of motion erupted from the back of the house. Kilo, moving with a 3-legged but terrifyingly fast gait, had burst through the flimsy screen of the back door. He wasn't just a dog. He was a weapon system. He crossed the yard in a silent dark streak, a canine missile aimed at the enemy. The third mercenary heard him at the last second. He turned, his rifle coming up, but it was too late. Kilo launched himself into the air, his jaws clamping down on the man's gun arm. The man screamed, a high, thin sound of pain and surprise. He fired a wild burst into the air as he went down, the dog a snarling, furious weight on top of him. Jake used the distraction. He sighted on the man's exposed leg and fired 2 controlled shots. The man screamed again and collapsed, his fight over. It was quiet again. Jake scanned the perimeter. No more movement. He let out a shaky breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. He limped out into the yard. Kilo stood over the downed man, his leg bleeding freely, but his stance was defiant. He looked at Jake, a low growl still rumbling in his chest, and then gave a short, sharp bark. All clear. Jake knelt beside him, running a hand over his head. Good boy, he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. Good boy, Kilo. He looked at the chaos around him. The downed men. The bullet-riddled house. He knew this wasn't the end. These men were just soldiers. The general who sent them was still out there. He had one card left to play. One phone number memorized years ago, for a man he hadn't spoken to since the day they pinned a medal on his chest and told him his war was over. He pulled out his phone, his hand shaking slightly, and dialed. It rang once. Wallace, a gruff voice answered. No greeting, no preamble. Captain, Jake said. It's Miller. I'm in trouble. There was a moment of silence on the other end. Where are you, son? Captain Wallace asked, and the simple question carried the weight of loyalty and command. My father's farm, north of Harrisburg, Jake said. There's been contact. 3 hostiles, neutralized but alive. They were after an asset. What kind of asset? Jake looked at Kilo, who was now licking his hand, his eyes soft. An MWD, designation Kilo 27. The silence on the other end of the line was profound. When Wallace spoke again, his voice was heavy, laced with something that sounded like grief. Stay put, Jake. Don't talk to anyone. A cleanup crew is on its way. I'm coming myself. The line went dead. Jake sat on the cold ground, the dog's head in his lap, and waited. An hour later, the sound of helicopters sliced through the night, not the chuff of a local news or police chopper, but the deep thrumming beat of military hardware. Two black helicopters descended on the field behind the barn, their searchlights cutting through the darkness. Men in unmarked tactical gear rappelled down, securing the scene with cold, terrifying efficiency. They disarmed and secured the three mercenaries, administered medical aid, and began scrubbing the area of any evidence that a firefight had ever occurred. A third helicopter landed, and from it emerged a man in a flight suit. He was older, his hair gray, but he moved with the same coiled energy Jake remembered. Captain, now Colonel. Wallace walked toward him, his face a grim mask. He stopped in front of Jake and looked down at the dog. His expression crumpled for a fraction of a second. Kilo, he said, his voice a choked whisper. Kilo's ears perked up. He whined softly and thumped his tail against the ground. He remembered the name. He remembered the man. I thought he was dead, Wallace said, his gaze shifting to Jake. The after-action report listed him as killed in action. Same blast that got Mark. The name hit Jake like a physical blow. Mark, his best friend, the man whose hand he had seen reaching for him in the fire. Mark's dog, Jake asked, his own voice barely audible. This was Mark's partner. Wallace nodded, his eyes filled with a deep sadness. They were inseparable. When we couldn't recover the body, we assumed. We were wrong. He knelt, extending a hand to Kilo, who licked it without hesitation. The full, ugly story came out. Kilo hadn't been killed. He'd been wounded, thrown clear by the blast. A private contractor on site, a man named Sterling, had found him. Sterling knew the value of a dog with Kilo's training and genetics. He stole him from the battlefield, falsified the report to list him as KIA, and smuggled him stateside. He'd been selling Kilo's services to the highest bidder, renting him out for protection, intimidation, and worse. The men who attacked the farm worked for Sterling. They weren't there to retrieve a dog. They were there to retrieve a multi-million-dollar piece of stolen military hardware. Cletus, the local who was abusing him, Jake pieced it together. He must have been one of Sterling's low-level clients. Kilo must have finally escaped from him. And he found you, Wallace finished, looking at Jake with a new understanding. Of all the derelict farms in all of Pennsylvania, he found his way to Mark's best friend. It wasn't a coincidence. It was fate. It was a debt. Jake looked down at the dog, at this living, breathing piece of his lost brother, and the grief he had held back for 3 years finally broke through. A single tear traced a path through the grime on his cheek. He wasn't just saving a dog. He was saving the last remnant of his family. He was honoring a promise he never knew he had to keep. What happens now? Jake asked, his voice rough. Sterling is a ghost we've been hunting for years, Wallace said, his voice turning to steel. You just handed us the string to unravel his entire network. My men will take it from here. As for you, officially, this never happened. You heard a noise, found an injured dog, and called an old friend for help. And Kilo? Jake asked. The most important question. Wallace looked at the dog, then back at the man. He saw the bond between them, the shared trauma, the mutual salvation. His official file says he's dead. As far as the United States military is concerned, Kilo 27 died a hero in Afghanistan. This, he said, gesturing to the shepherd, is just a dog, a stray who wandered onto your farm. I think he's found a good home. A military medic came over and expertly tended to Kilo's fresh wound, giving him a shot for the pain. Another team finished loading the mercenaries onto a helicopter. Within 30 minutes, it was as if they had never been there. The helicopters lifted off, their sound fading into the night, leaving only the whisper of the wind. Jake was alone again, but not empty. He and Wallace stood in the yard as the dawn began to break, painting the eastern sky in shades of gray and pink. Thank you, Jake said. Mark would have done the same for you, Wallace replied. He put a hand on Jake's shoulder. He'd be proud of you, Jake. Not for what you did over there, for what you did here tonight. Welcome home, son. Colonel Wallace left, and Jake carried Kilo back inside the bullet-scarred house. He laid him on the blankets, and for the first time since he'd been back, Jake slept without nightmares. He slept the deep, dreamless sleep of a man who had finally, truly, come home from the war. 1 year later, the farm was unrecognizable. The rust was gone from the gate. The fences were mended, straight and strong. The fields were cleared, and a small but thriving vegetable garden grew near the house. The farmhouse itself had been repaired. The windows were new, the walls patched and painted, the porch swept clean. It wasn't a palace, but it was a home. It was alive. Jake sat on the porch steps, a cup of coffee steaming in his hands. The scar around his eye was still there, a pale silver map of his past, but his eyes were clear. The haunted look was gone, replaced by a quiet calm. The ghosts were still there, but they were silent now. They were memories, not tormentors. A heavy head rested on his knee. Kaiser, Jake had decided his real name deserved to be used, looked up at him, his dark eyes soft. He was no longer skeletal. His coat was thick and glossy, his body strong and muscled. His back leg had healed with a slight limp, a matching scar to Jake's own. They were a pair of broken soldiers who had pieced each other back together. Dr. Eris Thorne's truck pulled up the gravel driveway. She got out, a smile on her face. She came by once a week, at first to check on Kaiser, but now, more often than not, just to share a cup of coffee and the quiet peace of the farm. She brought a bag of dog treats and a local newspaper. "He looks good, Jake," she said, scratching Kaiser behind the ears. "We're both doing okay," Jake replied, and it was the truth. They had found a new rhythm, a new life. They woke with the sun, worked the land, and in the evenings they sat on the porch and watched the stars come out. They had built a new pack, a small family forged in violence and healed by loyalty. Jake had found his purpose not in the grand mission of war, but in the simple, profound act of caring for another living soul. Kaiser nudged his hand, and Jake smiled, rubbing the dog's strong neck. The old farmer, his father, had left him this broken land and told him to watch over the animals. He had never understood what that meant until now. It wasn't about livestock. It was about watching over the lost, the broken, the abandoned. It was about finding the one worth fighting for. In saving Kaiser, Jake had finally saved himself. The war was over. He was home.